In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It may seem a bit like cheating to preach on the gospel passage this week, given that it includes an explanation for the parable. And it does seem that the meaning is pretty straightforward. The explanation given in verses 18 through 23 tells us each of the types of soil described in the parable corresponds to a level of receptivity in the one who hears the word of the kingdom. The first place the seed was sown was on the path or wayside. These were paths between the fields that were well trodden and packed down so tightly they became hard as concrete. Inevitably, as seed was cast out into the field, some of it would land on this path. But because of how hard the ground was, the seed would never penetrate the earth. It simply became meals for the birds. This type of soil is representative of someone who hears the word of the kingdom, but does not understand. And this means certainly more than just ignorance, misunderstanding, or even lack of intelligence. Rather, to not understand means to willfully reject or ignore the truth contained in the seed that has been given to us. This is a hardness of heart produced by our prejudice, our pride, and our fear. Our prejudice makes us blind to the things that we don't want to see. Our pride keeps us from admitting our knowledge and understanding is limited. Our fear keeps us from seeking understanding because the word of the kingdom challenges our presuppositions and our comfort and condemns the things that we love. The word of the kingdom cannot penetrate the hardness of this heart. The second place the seed was sown was on rocky ground. Now, this wasn't just soil with rocks in it, but instead it was a hefty layer of limestone that had several inches of soil on top of it. And because this soil heated so quickly in the sun, the seed would take root and sprout quickly. But since there was little depth of soil, the root couldn't go deep enough to find the life-sustaining moisture it needed to survive. The sun would end up scorching it, and the plant would wither and die. This type of soil is representative of those who hear the word of the kingdom and immediately accept it, but who abandon it when faced with trials and persecution. The word of the kingdom is not simply a propositional truth to which we heartily agree, but is rather a truth that we are called to embody. Living the gospel can be difficult to do. Even though, as we heard last week, Jesus tells us that his yoke is easy and his burden is light, we must not misunderstand that the gospel makes demands of us and implicates us in a particular way of life. When those demands cause us to abandon our faith or our convictions, we are like the rocky ground that cannot sustain the growing seed. The third place the seed was sown was among the thorns. Here, the seed takes root, but because of the aggressive and competitive root system of the thorns, the plant is unable to access sufficient nutrients and water and is eventually choked out. This type of soil is representative of those who hear and accept the word of the kingdom, but allow the thorns or the anxieties of the world and the lure of wealth to crowd out the word. This is particularly relevant to the church in the West. Our concern for position and power often conflicts with the demands of the gospel, particularly in relation to the poor. And we typically find ways of justifying our giving in to the lure of wealth. We want the gospel to give our lives meaning, but we want it to do so without judgment. We want the gospel, Stanley Hauerwas explains that wealth stills the imagination because we are not forced, as the disciples were forced, to be an alternative to the world that only necessity can create. Possessed by possessions, we desire to act in the world, often on behalf of the poor, but without having to lose our possessions. Finally, we are told about the fate of the seed in the good soil, the soil that has been tilled and prepared for the seed, that accepts it, nourishes it, allows it to grow, and finally to produce fruit. This soil is representative of those who hear and understand the word of the kingdom, accept it, and appropriate it into their lives, bearing fruit. William Barclay suggests that people who are like good soil have 4 characteristics. They have an open mind and are willing to learn. They are prepared to hear the word, never too proud or too busy to listen. They understand the word, and they translate the hearing of the word into obedience. As the explanation suggests, the primary point of the parable is to underscore the fact that as the seed, or the word of the kingdom, is being sown among people, it will meet various levels of receptivity. And parables, like similes and allegorical anecdotes, begin to break down if pushed too far. But I'm curious if this particular parable offers us any other insights than the ones already proffered by the explanation. Here's a few questions that seem to be left unanswered. One question we might ask after hearing this parable and its explanation concern the fruit that the seed planted in good soil bears. As we've already seen, the seed symbolizes the word of the kingdom. Given the context of this parable in Matthew's gospel, the word of the kingdom is Jesus' proclamation of the good news of the kingdom. Narratively, it points back to the content of the discourse sections, which have their foundation in the Sermon on the Mount and is illustrated in the healing narratives. This good news is a message of wholeness and restoration, of compassion and justice, and of forgiveness and reconciliation. In the trajectory of Matthew's gospel, the fruit produced by the good seed in good soil is not some abstract ideology disconnected from the pattern of life that we embody. When we receive, accept, and understand the word of the kingdom, we take it and appropriate it into our lives. When these words are used in the New Testament, the combination of hearing and understanding always connotes an acceptance of and an adherence to a moral obligation. Another question that comes to mind about this parable is whether the person described as a particular soil is always only that kind of soil. The parable doesn't really offer us a point of reflection here. Each of the soils and their corresponding people seem pretty static. But our life experiences might suggest that this seems to be a fair question to ask. I'm sure if any one of us were to take honest stock of our lives, we could look back and pinpoint times in our lives where we have embodied the characteristics of each of the soils. In fact, it would seem that the process of growth through discipleship would guarantee that there may be the existence of more than one type of soil in our hearts at any given time. I want to close by making a final observation about the explanation. I've always found it interesting that in the explanation found in Matthew, the sower is not mentioned again. But the parable seems to suggest something about the sower that I think is often overlooked, but is nevertheless significant for our understanding of the parable and its meaning for our lives. The sower in this parable doesn't seem to care that not all of the seed is productive. They don't meticulously plant seeds only in the places it is guaranteed to produce fruit. Instead, the sower spreads seeds with reckless abandon in what might seem to us wasteful quantities. There's something beautiful about this picture of a God who relentlessly casts the seeds of the kingdom regardless of the receptivity it will encounter. The God of this gospel does not pick and choose the ground upon which the seeds of the kingdom will be scattered. And if we can assume that the different types of soil are present in each of us, then it further highlights the generosity of God. Steve Pankey, who is rector of Christ Episcopal Church in Bowling Green, Kentucky, thinks that this parable is really a description of our prodigal God. He states, God knows that it is foolish to spread seed on unworthy soil, but he does it anyway. God spreads his love with reckless abandon in hearts that are at once all four types of soil. He throws seed at the disciples who, over and over and over again, prove that they have hard hearts, stiff necks, and dim minds. Jesus continues to throw seed at them, continues to work with them, and continues to help them see what God is up to in the world around them. He scatters the seed of the gospel with wild prodigality, and even when it is clear that his disciples just don't get it, when they turn him over to the authorities, abandon him in his hour of need, and deny even knowing him, Jesus continues to pour out his love on them by inviting them back into the fold after the resurrection. God is downright foolish in his love for you and me as well. We who continue in the proud, hard-hearted, stiff-necked, and dim-minded tradition of the disciples. We who seek morals and stories that have none. We who ignore morals and stories that call us to action. We who neglect to build the kingdom and instead focus on building ourselves. We who show again and again why we need forgiveness, and we who forget again and again to give it. The good news is God continues to throw seed at us. God pours out his love upon us relentlessly. And when God finds even the smallest patch of good soil in our hearts, God nurtures the kingdom within us, producing an abundant harvest, 30, 60, even 100-fold.